Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about myocyte action potentials. I was reviewing some physiology because of some antiarrhythmic drugs that we were learning about in school, and today I was thinking, I have not reviewed the action potential, so like the actual physiology that's behind it. So let's go ahead and talk about that. But the first thing we should probably talk about is why our heart initiates action potentials for its own cells a little bit differently than, say, skeletal muscle. You are going to see that there are two nodes, and you may have already learned this, but there's an SA node, and this is an SA node, and that's our heart's natural pacemaker. Oh, it looks like it's not letting me draw from up there, but just know this is the SA node, and it sits in the right atrium of the heart. This is the top right portion of the heart. This is the right chamber. The top right chamber, the right atrium, and then you've got the left atrium, and then this is the right ventricle, and this is the left ventricle. And so just a little physiology, just remember, and a little anatomy and physiology. But here in your right atrium, it's going to feed blood into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will take that deoxygenated blood into the lungs. That oxygenated blood from the lungs will go into the left atrium, go into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then pump out into the systemic circulation, meaning to all of your limbs and your muscles and your other organs. But just remember that this isn't obviously the most anatomically correct, but it goes into the AV node, and that's your AV node right there. And then that goes into the His bundle, which is HIS, and that's the His bundle. And then that goes into the Purkinje fibers, which come up the Purkinje fibers come up the walls of the ventricles. And that's going to induce our action potentials. And that is why when the SA node initiates its action potential, that all will make it basically a ripple effect, so that all the cardiac myocytes will actually induce their own action potentials because they kind of share those gap junctions. And that's the difference between basically your skeletal muscle and your myocytes. Your myocytes will share those action potentials through those gap junctions, as we'll see here. But again, just another brief reminder that here's just a basic EKG. You've got your P wave, QRS complex, and your T wave. But what we really care about right now is your P wave, which is your atrial depolarization. And here's your QRS complex, which your ventricular, oh my lord, sorry about that, depolarization. And then the T wave is your ventricular repolarization. You may be wondering where, repolarization. You may be wondering, where is the atrial repolarization? Well, the atrial repolarization sits behind, basically happens when the ventricles will depolarize, but because the ventricles are so much larger, it's actually masked by that. So atrial depolarization is the first thing that happens, and then remember that's because the SA node sits in the right atria, and then basically it'll communicate across all of the atria, and then that goes down into the ventricles and comes up with the Purkinje fibers, and that's kind of how that goes. But basically what's really going on physiologically when we're looking at just strictly the ion channels that will actually precede all of this, will actually do all of this work. So we've got the phase 0, 1, 2, and 3, and then the phase 4 of your myocyte action potential. So phase 0 is the one we're going to start with, even though phase 4 looks like it's the first one. The reason I put these little vertical lines on this horizontal line is to show you that phase 4 actually is just continuous. So this phase 4 is what's going to come after phase 3 and before phase 0 and lead into phase 0. But phase 0 is what we will call, so we're talking about phase 0 here. Phase 0 is this entire area right here. And so this is what we call the rapid depolarization. And this is also called the, not influx, upstroke. And so your upstroke is where your myocytes are going to say, all right, we really need this action potential, and we're just going to go for it. And so what happens is you're going to get these INA, so this is actually INA. These channels will open, and it'll cause an influx of sodium. So you remember your sodium ions. And so your sodium ions will enter that myocyte, and that rapid influx will cause that to go over 0 millivolts. And that 0 millivolts, because we are now above 0 millivolts, we can begin and initiate the depolarization. That depolarization is fully into the area above the 0 millivolts, and now we've begun our action potential. So after we have had this influx of sodium channels from the INA channels, we will have phase one. Phase one is what we call kind of basically a miniature repolarization, but it's a small repolarization. So it's not enough to the point where we're going back to resting membrane potential before we can actually initiate another one. This is so that we can actually enter. So actually we should talk about what's going on here, but that's actually your potassium. So your potassium will come in and these will open, and that will cause a potassium influx. So your potassium channel opens, that's IK. You don't have to put the IK plus, it might just say IK, but physiologically know that it's IK voltage gated. Potassium channels will open. That causes a potassium influx in phase one, and that's what causes this little like notch right here. So that portion right there is actually where phase two starts, but that's where phase one starts. And so phase two, the reason we have the small repolarization is so that phase two can be its plateau. And that's why, and this is actually where this differs from your skeletal muscle, because you have a plateau phase, meaning that we're going to elongate the amount of time that the myocyte spends over 0 millivolts in its membrane potential. And the reason we do that is so that the calcium channels open, and that causes a calcium influx. Okay, we've got a lot of influxes coming in, but we should probably just mention that the INA channels have already closed in phase one. Okay, and so I'm going to kind of just section that off there so that you know that in phase one, your potassium channels will open, potassium influx causing that small repolarization, and then your INA channels will close and just cause a small, basically so that we're not, continuously depolarizing to the point where it's just way too much. And now in phase two, your potassium channels will open, and that will cause a massive calcium influx. And because of that, we're going to get what we call a calcium influx. And then when we have that calcium influx, this isn't actually what causes the contraction. You need calcium, this calcium influx, to open up the calcium. This is actually 2 plus. Oh my gosh. Your calcium to come in from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so I'm going to abbreviate the sarcoplasmic reticulum SR. This is where a difference from skeletal muscle, because remember in skeletal muscle, you just needed the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then it'll start the contraction of the muscle cell. However, for myocytes, the cardiac muscle, you actually need the ICA channels, which are found only in this, to actually open up, take in calcium into the cell. That will then cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium, and that's what actually triggers the contraction. So you need calcium to get calcium. And I know that sounds weird, but that's just the way that this is, and that's the reason we have a whole plateau. So this whole area right here is your phase two. All right. And so I'm going to make a double-edged arrow here so that we can know that this is all phase two, and that's why it's a plateau phase. And the reason we call it plateau phase is because we're still existing above that 0 millivolts needed to initiate this action potential. And so that's where we get myocyte contraction. Phase two is myocyte contraction. So we are going to finally contract those bands. Those Z bands will start to come together or come closer, and then the cell will actually start to contract, and then we've got, let's say this is the ventricle, let's say it's the left ventricle, it will start to contract and then push blood into the aorta, and then it goes out everywhere. And then after we've done that, we want to now depolarize the cell, because we don't want to exist in this phase because we can't actually contract again. So you don't want your heart just beating once and then that's it, because obviously there are major implications for that. So phase three is our rapid depolarization or repolarization. So phase three is rapid repolarization. And so here your calcium channels will close, those ICA channels are now closed, and then the potassium channels are now fully open. Okay, and this is going to cause a massive influx. So this area right here is phase three. And so this is going to cause a massive influx of potassium, not Ke. I'm not talking about that. We're We're talking about just potassium. So the potassium ions will massively influx, and because of that, we are now going to go down into our phase 4, which means that we can now initiate another action potential. So phase 4, remember this is just, you can initiate another action potential. So right here is, so from, let's make a different color here. Let's do yellow. So I just want to point this out. So from here to about here is your effective refractory period. And so this means that you cannot initiate, in bold, initiate another action potential. Oh, not AP. Yep, there we go, AP. So you can't initiate another action potential, and that's why we have phase 3, so that we can actually initiate another action potential. And so your effective refractory period is because of that. And then you've also got your absolute and your relative refractory period, but those are kind of the outside of the scope of this. Just know your effective refractory period exists on this entire area where we're initiating this action potential, and then we're not going to initiate another action potential because you don't want to confuse the cell, basically trying to get it to continuously try and initiate another action potential. And this should probably make sense to you, because if you think about it, we're already contracting, so there's no point of actually putting up another action potential, because it's physiologically impossible with the ions coming in and out of the cell as this whole phase exists. So phase 0, 1, 2, and most of phase 3 is going to be the effective refractory period. And so this is just kind of a summary of it so that you guys have it. Remember, phase 0, you've got the sodium channels opening, rapid influx of sodium. That's the depolarization, which we also term upstroke. And then phase 1, we're going to get the potassium channels to open, and that's the initial repolarization, but it is small. So just remember that it is small in this one. And then we have sodium channels that are closed. And then phase 2, big buzzword on that is your plateau phase. And the big thing here is that the calcium channels will open. And another thing I should probably mention are these are L-type channels, and this does matter because this is unique to the to the myocytes as well. It's just a different type of voltage gated ion channel. And then that calcium influx through the calcium channels will allow the calcium to come in, basically unlocks and triggers the calcium to release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum and then release into the cell. And this is where you get the myocyte contraction. So CX is just an abbreviation for contraction. And then remember that your IK cells in this portion actually begin to open fully. So I should probably put fully here. Open fully. And then phase 3, you get a massive potassium influx, and this is the rapid repolarization. And then this is where your calcium channels will close, And then in phase 4, you're now back to resting membrane potential, and you can initiate, another action potential. Can initiate another action potential now. And you also have a high potassium permeability in this portion so that we can make sure that it stays down there until we need to get another one. And then just to go back up here, remember that phase 4 exists until we hit the portion that the INA channels open, and then the whole process goes back to what we started from. So if you like this video, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And let me know down in the comments below what we can do to change up the videos to make them a little bit better. And as always, thank you so much.